Hello, my name's Barry Snellgrove, and thank you very much for inviting me to talk about victims' services in England and Wales. I'm a former civil servant working for 18 years within the criminal justice system at the Home Office and Ministry of Justice. My work focused particularly on areas of policy for offenders in prison, those released from prison, and those on community sentences. I've managed contracts to deliver electronic monitoring, tagging of offenders, and worked in inspection and assurance of services delivered by prisons and probation. And I also headed an international projects team in the Ministry of Justice, which assisted other countries in developing new and improved justice and security services. But for the 21 years before that, I worked in the probation service, and much of what I'm going to say is from that perspective in relation to victims. This service supervises adult offenders in the community and helps and supports those in prison to prepare for their eventual release. When I qualified as a probation officer in 1980, I very quickly realised that the distinction between offender and victim is often not a clear one, and they very frequently are the same people. Those living in deprived communities where offending is high are often also the victims of burglaries, assaults, theft, robbery from the person. And also those offending have often come from criminal families where they were victims of neglect and abuse. Myself and my manager in my earlier years as a probation officer in 1982 determined to help two local magistrates set up a victims service to support victims of crime. It was at a time when victim support wasn't funded by the government, and many people were rightly criticising government for investing in prisons, programmes, services for offenders, but nobody seemed to offer much for victims. Also, the court process could be almost as upsetting for those victims appearing in the courts when they were cross-examined as witnesses almost as much as the original crimes had been upsetting. And this was particularly true of sexual assaults, where interrogation in court by solicitors for the defence can be very personal and accusatory in public. In 1980, a filmmaker called Roger Grafe made a television documentary following the police as they responded to rape victims. Their methods of questioning an inappropriate environment for women traumatised by rape invoked a call for improved services for victims of rape. In one scene in the documentary, a woman claimed to have been raped by 3 men and was treated harshly by 3 male police officers. The film was shown in 1982 and questions were raised in Parliament by the then Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, leading to lasting changes and greater awareness of the needs of rape victims. Police provided rape suites, which were more like houses or small hospital clinics to make women feel more supported as they were examined and questioned about their ordeal. There was greater attention given to employing more women police officers and more sympathetic lines of questioning to ensure women felt supported in giving full statements and evidence at court. The film was shown in Sweden and the USA and led to lasting changes in treatment of rape victims, leading to more women reporting rape. There were 13,000 in 2003 compared to only 1,800 in 1985. And over the past 5 years, cases reported to the police and initially recorded as rape have risen sharply to 59,747. However, the proportion making it to court and prosecutions has more than halved in that time, so there's still a lot to do. In the same way that domestic violence shelters were set up to protect women by Erin Pizzey in the 1970s, rape crisis centres were also set up for victims of rape. Our current issue is that services partially funded by government are very strained, with up to a year on the waiting list for support. 2018-19 helped 80,000 victims compared to 50,000 in 2015. And according to Rape Crisis England and Wales, which has 41 centres, there were 6,069 individuals, including 172 children waiting for a specialist face-to-face service, as at the end of March last year. Victim support services. The late 1970s and 80s had highlighted the need for more services for victims and a greater balance of those services between victims and offenders. It was the era of development of victim support, which came out of a public outcry that victims get less help than offenders. But interestingly, initial victim support schemes were set up by the very service providing support to offenders, the probation service. Set up more than 40 years ago, Victim Support is the leading independent victims charity in England and Wales. The first victim support scheme was set up in Bristol in 1974, and by 1986, every county in England and Wales had at least one victim support scheme. Victim Support registered as a charitable company in 1987 and set up a free national telephone helpline called Supportline in 1998 and is now government funded. Many local schemes were started, as my own in North London, via local police, courts, probation and volunteer agencies, and were independent of government, but funding has increased centrally to establish Victim Support National Organisation. And the schemes can signpost to local help and support. Police collaborate by telling victims about the services provided and passing on details of their support line telephone number and the website details. They also pass on the details of the victims to the local schemes so they can directly contact them to offer help. I'll never forget how satisfying it was to receive a message of support and help from my local scheme in Enfield and North London that I'd helped set up, when later, 10 years later, I was victim of a robbery. I'd trained the first tranche of volunteers offering that help 10 years earlier. The way it works is that volunteers will make contact, listen, advise, and then refer or signpost to more specialist services in the very traumatic cases, and also help victims to apply for compensation. And all of this is at the victim's pace, and they can now use the website to tailor their own level of support. The volunteer meets the need for the victim to go over the situation and somebody outside of their family who will listen and who knows the system to advise them. For example, how to prepare for giving evidence as a witness in court. Now, the increase of victims' rights has stepped up in recent years, and in 2013, the government appointed a Victims Commissioner as an independent post to challenge government and services on standards. It has full independence, free to advise, challenge, and she can offer her own views. The Victims Commissioner is Dame Vera Baird, and she said, "I want all victims to be treated with dignity and respect, kept informed, and to get quality services to help them cope and recover. I intend to press for national standards so they are good wherever a victim lives." Her aims are to expect humane treatment of victims, to champion a victims' code and witness charter, which monitors and reports the agencies on their compliance with standards, to review services and make recommendations, and that's to build services based on what works principles, namely communication, procedural justice, interagency cooperation, and professionalisation, and then make recommendations on how to improve. Fourthly, to be the voice of victims. Fifthly, to promote best practice in victims' schemes through gaining first-hand knowledge and actively promoting examples. In 2016, the Commissioner commissioned a What Works report by the University of Portsmouth by Elaine Wedlock and Jacqueline Tapley. In 2016, that report informed development of standards for victims' work, and it drew together the current evidence base on what works, supporting victims through their journey in the criminal justice system. All professionals working with victims of crime must be aware that the basic provision of information can assist them in coping with the impact of victimisation, the intensity of which can be wide-ranging. A lack of information, protection and support can only act to aggravate these symptoms further, and in many cases result in victims disengaging from the criminal justice process and withdrawing their cooperation so offenders are not prosecuted. Some victims require support immediately, others it need it later on when they notice changes in their behaviour as the impact of the offence hits them. It's important to note that even though a majority of victims are able to turn to informal sources of emotional support, not everyone has this, and the support scheme can step in at this point. One of the fundamental problems is that no one agency takes responsibility for them, and they have a journey through a variety of agencies, from police, courts, probation service, and victim support agencies. A good victim policy would be to reduce the importance of being a victim and instead emphasize an identity based on having been able to restore dignity as a decision maker in one's own life, said Christie in 2008. The literature highlights the need for accurate and timely information, but effective means of communicating this to victims, and indeed effective ways of listening to them so they get the right information at the time that they need it. So in summary, what works in supporting victims of crime, the literature demonstrated multi-agency partnerships can be effective in sharing information and reducing duplication that often causes more harm and distress to victims. Providing a joined-up service reduces the confusion felt by victims. It supports them in their journey through the criminal justice system and also means they're more likely to engage with that system, increasing the likelihood of successful prosecutions. The evidence also shows that a professionalised, single point of contact service is an effective means of providing emotional support. The literature demonstrates that in order to support victims in this way, the single point of contact should be a professional post with sufficient knowledge and training in the workings of the criminal justice system, as well as compassion and empathy needed to be a source of moral support. So what about victims and the police? Well, criminal justice agencies in England and Wales abide by the Code of Practice for Victims of Crime, which has been recently updated in 2018. This is a set of guidelines designed to make sure victims of crime are given the best advice, support and service. Victims should expect to be treated in a respectful, sensitive and professional manner without any discrimination of any kind. They should be given support, appropriate support to cope and recover. They should be protected from being victimised again and shown how to access information and support in future. Victims' details should always remain confidential, and their address and other personal information should never be made available to suspects or offenders. And witnesses of crime, more generally, should be protected in a similar way, and they have a set of standards in England and Wales called the Witness Charter. What about victims and the courts? Well, the Witness Charter sets out the standards of care you can expect as a witness to a crime or incident, including if you've been a victim. And as a witness, you're helping to ensure that justice is done. If you know something about an incident, you may be asked to give evidence in court for the prosecution or the defence. And if you know one of the people involved in a case, you may be asked to provide evidence as a character witness, usually by the defence. In either event, your evidence can be crucial to securing the conviction or acquittal of the defendant. The Charter covers both prosecution and defence witnesses. The Crown Prosecution Service is also covered by this Charter, and staff in Her Majesty's Courts and Tribunal Service, and the Witness Service and defence lawyers. Although the standards in the Charter aren't legally binding, they do set out the level of service that a witness should expect. And in circumstances where a service provider is unable to meet a standard, you should be informed of this and efforts made to accommodate your needs. Victims and the Probation Service. The Probation Service not only works with offenders to manage risk and reduce reoffending, but also victims of crime. And if a person has been a victim of a serious sexual or violent crime, and the perpetrator of that crime has been sentenced to 12 months or more in prison, that person has the right to receive information and consultation service from the Probation Service. Initially, probation staff contact the victim to offer support, but it's for the victim to decide whether to engage with that service. Consent is always retained by the victim. Victim support is a specialist area of probation work and is carried out by a dedicated team of victim liaison officers. Work involves helping the victims establish their voice within the criminal justice system. They will look after more than victims of sexual and violent offences where the offender has been sentenced to more than a year in prison, as well as victims of youth offenders and mental health cases. They visit the homes of victims and provide face-to-face comfort and can listen to the victims, including creating exclusion zones to protect the victims from offenders when the offenders are released from custody, from prison. They help to describe the criminal justice system to the victim in detail and begin a relationship where they will keep them updated throughout the sentence developments and, if necessary, signpost the victim to appropriate counselling. I want to say something also about victims of domestic abuse. Domestic abuse, as defined as an incident or pattern of incidents of controlling, coercive, threatening, degrading and violent behaviour, including sexual violence, in the majority of cases by a partner or ex-partner, but also by a family member or carer. It's very common. In the vast majority of cases, it's experienced by women and is perpetrated by men. It can include coercive control, a pattern of intimidation, degradation, isolation and control with the use or threat of physical or sexual violence. Women's Aid, a big organisation in England and Wales that set up refuges for women who are victims of abuse, campaigned for changes in the law to take account of coercive control. And this has marked a huge step in tackling domestic abuse. It can involve psychological, emotional abuse, physical or sexual abuse, financial or economic abuse, misuse of partner's money in a controlling manner, misuse for credit cards, for example, harassment or stalking. Stalking is a pattern of persistent and unwanted attention that makes you feel pestered, scared, anxious or harassed. And some examples are unwanted gifts, unwanted communications, a lot of phone calls, texts, damaging property or spying on victims or threats. And also online domestic abuse can provide behaviours such as monitoring social media profiles or abuse over social media. Finally, I want to turn to electronic monitoring as a tool to support victims. Sometimes it's known as tagging. In the last 21 years, technology has been used to protect victims as well as control and monitor offenders' behaviour. In England and Wales, technology can be used to monitor the whereabouts of some offenders via satellite tracking or location monitoring, or they can be excluded from some areas measured by alerts if they stray into exclusion zones. For many years now, offenders can also be subject to curfews restricting their movements from their home address. Probation officers can request these measures are inserted in licence conditions of release from prison, or if offenders are subject to community orders, they can have conditions inserted into those orders, preventing them from approaching areas where their victims live. Electronic monitoring has grown massively in England and Wales and is the largest nationwide system in the world. In conclusion, I've set out how victim services have grown incrementally since their early days, rooted in voluntary schemes in the mid-1970s. Successive governments have sought to redress the balance between resources for correction, control and rehabilitation of offenders, to prevent further victimisation, to ensuring victims are supported, helped and compensated for their ordeal. There is now much more funding from central government to enhance services for victims of domestic violence, rape, and more recently, those subject to stalking and internet crimes. The advent of the Victims Commissioner back in 2013 has made sure that codes of practice are implemented across all criminal justice services to ensure a consistency of provision. But there's still more to do, especially in the area of rape victims, where more victims are reporting the crime, but too few offenders are convicted. The Witness Charter also ensures that victims and other witnesses are also treated carefully and supported throughout the criminal justice process. Finally, in the last 20 years, technology has developed to protect victims from offenders via curfew and location monitoring, so that risks are minimised proportionately and victims can feel safer. I hope that this has been helpful to you to understand the work in England and Wales, and I provided references to the documents that I've referred to and the schemes that I've referred to. I wish you well with the rest of your studies. Thank you.